Hi, today I wanted to do a review of labor markets. So we've done a little bit of this before, but let's make sure we understand the idea correctly. Um, and this actually applies not just to labor markets, it's in general to factor markets. Whenever we're talking about inputs we use in production, we call those factors of production. So the typical factors of production we deal with is labor, which is the workers, and capital, which is the machines. So L for labor and K for capital. Okay. But in this discussion, I'm mostly going to talk about the labor market. Okay. Um, when we talk about labor and capital, one nice way to think about it is similar to when we talk about consumer choice theory, when we talk about how do consumers decide how much to purchase of an item. And when we were deciding how do we figure out why people choose to buy and how much they choose to buy of an item, we brought in utility theory. So we said that when people are choosing to buy, let's say I'm buying t-shirts and I want to decide how many t-shirts I buy, I get utility from the items I'm buying. Okay, we said that utility is such that as I consume more and more t-shirts, the utility is increasing but at a decreasing rate. Okay, this is total utility. Okay, and the slope of total utility is becoming flatter and flatter. What is the slope? The slope of total utility is marginal utility. Okay, so there is diminishing marginal utility. Okay, and we said that the consumer's choice problem is to figure out how much to buy of an item. And the answer was that you compare the additional utility you get from one more unit with the cost of that one more unit. Okay, so if the cost is the price, okay, let's say I want to decide how many t-shirts to buy. So I say, okay, should I buy one more t-shirt? Well, what's the marginal utility of one more t-shirt versus how much does that one more t-shirt cost? And as long as the marginal utility is greater than or equal to price, I buy it, okay? If the marginal utility is less than price, I do not buy it. Okay, so I don't buy it if it's less than price. And ideally, if I, for the last t-shirt I buy, okay, what must be true or what should be true if I'm optimizing is that the marginal utility I get, the satisfaction, the additional satisfaction I get from the last t-shirt I buy is exactly equal to the cost of that last t-shirt. Okay, this is true for the last t-shirt I buy, which means for all previous t-shirts, the marginal utility was greater since marginal utility is diminishing with quantity, right? So you can imagine here's marginal utility, okay? So, if this is the price, okay, this is where you stop. This is the quantity where you stop, but for all previous ones, the marginal utility was greater than the price, okay? And in fact, we said the marginal utility curve is really the demand curve for t-shirts, okay? This is the willingness to pay, okay? Why the willingness to pay? You're willing to pay this much for this t-shirt because that's the marginal utility you get from it. You're willing to pay this much for this t-shirt because that's the marginal utility you get. The difference between the marginal utility and what you actually had to pay was consumer surplus, okay? How does this tie into what we're talking about? We're talking about factors of production. So we say, well, just like when we make the whole analysis of how do consumers decide how many t-shirts to buy, when it comes to firms making a decision, okay, how do firms decide how many workers to buy, how many machines to buy? And it's going to be the same thing, that companies, firms are going to decide how much labor to hire, how many workers to hire, by comparing the marginal benefit of one more worker with the marginal cost of one more worker. Okay? And as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to marginal cost, you keep hiring. For the last worker that you hire, the marginal benefit, if you're optimizing, is just equal to the marginal cost. Okay? Okay. Now, before I go further, I just want to say, when we talk about, no, actually, let me stop there. So basically, this is the formula, right? You're deciding how many workers to hire based on comparing the marginal benefit per worker with the marginal cost per worker. Likewise, you're deciding how many machines to buy or to use by comparing the marginal benefit per machine with the marginal cost of each machine. Okay. All right, so now let's keep that in mind, marginal benefit with marginal cost. Okay? Let's dig deeper into marginal benefit. What's the benefit I get from each worker? Okay, and so let's think about a situation where I'm hiring the worker so that I can produce baskets. Okay, so let's say that the productivity of the workers, so if I look at for labor, L for labor, how many workers I get. So if I hire one worker, okay, I can get, so this is total product, how many baskets can be produced, okay? So one worker can produce this many baskets. If I hire a second worker, he produces this many baskets, and so on. So we say the total product as you hire more and more workers is increasing. This is total product, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. Okay? So we have what's called diminishing marginal product. Right? Marginal product of labor. The additional product you get from each additional worker is diminishing. Why is there a diminishing marginal product of labor? Because we say as long as one of the factors is fixed, so for example, if the space is fixed or the number of machines is fixed, as long as one of the factors is fixed, eventually you hit diminishing marginal product of labor. And so this isn't always, right? So in other words, you could have a situation where initially, the marginal product of labor is increasing, but eventually you're going to have marginal product of labor falling. Okay, because at some point, the fact that you're keeping one of the factors fixed is going to start to bite, and then you have diminishing marginal product of labor. Okay, so this mirrors the whole idea of diminishing marginal utility, right? Okay. Now, again, let's go back to, we're thinking about how much benefit I get from each additional worker. Okay? So, for each additional worker, oops, actually, you know what, I'll do it this way. Okay. For each additional worker, the worker produces the marginal product of labor, right? Marginal product of labor says if I hire one more worker, how many baskets can this worker produce, okay? Now, let's say the worker can produce 2 baskets, okay? I have to value that in dollars, so I have to multiply that by the value of each basket to get the value of marginal product of labor. That's my marginal benefit of hiring one more worker. One more worker brings me this much value, which is the multiplication of marginal product of labor, how many baskets, times the value of each basket. Okay? What is this value? So this value depends on whether the goods market that I sell my baskets in is perfectly competitive or a monopoly. If the market for baskets is perfectly competitive, then the value of each basket, so under perfect competition, in the goods market, that's the market where I'm selling my baskets, okay, the value per basket is the price. So then the value of the marginal product of labor is the same as price times the marginal product of labor. Okay? This was the value of the marginal product of labor. Because, in other words, for every additional basket I sell, okay, how much benefit do I get? The price. Okay? And it doesn't matter how many baskets I sell. For every additional basket, I get the same price. So that's the additional benefit I get per basket times how many baskets the worker produces. That's the value I get for each worker. Okay? Alternatively, if the market for baskets is a monopoly, so if I'm the only one selling baskets, okay, for every additional, so the value per basket, every additional basket I sell, how much do I get for it? I get the marginal revenue. Okay, that's the benefit I get per basket. Okay, which, if you remember, in monopoly, marginal revenue is less than price because of the price effect. Because when I sell more baskets, I have to lower the price on all the previous baskets. So marginal revenue is less than price. Okay, so if you're selling in a goods market that is a monopoly, the value of marginal product of labor becomes marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor, which we refer to as the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay? So, again, if you're selling in a perfectly competitive goods market, the value of marginal product of labor is the price times the marginal product of labor. If you sell in a monopoly, the value of marginal product of labor is marginal revenue times marginal product of labor. And we refer to that as the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay? Either way, this is, right, that's the value of marginal product of labor. That's how much value I'm getting for each worker. And since the marginal product of labor is typically diminishing, right? As you hire more and more workers, the value of marginal product of labor is falling. So this is really the demand for labor. Okay? The demand for labor is the value of marginal product of labor. Okay. All right. So let's repeat that. So for any firm, the value of marginal product of labor is the demand for labor. Okay? And the reason it's diminishing is because marginal product of labor is typically diminishing. Okay? Now, what can affect the demand for labor? Okay? Well, since we said the value of marginal product of labor is either equal to price times marginal product of labor or marginal revenue times marginal product of labor. Okay? So the demand for labor is going to be a function of, okay, it's going to be affected by the price of my product, right? If my product becomes more popular, the price goes up, then the value of marginal product of labor goes up, the value of marginal product of labor, the demand curve shifts to the right. The marginal product of labor, if my workers become more productive, okay, then the whole demand curve shifts to the right. And then other inputs, okay, supply of other inputs, how does that affect the demand for labor? It depends whether those other inputs complement labor or substitute for labor. So if I come up with a machine that substitutes for labor, okay, that's going to, and there's more such machines and they become cheap, that's going to shift my demand for labor to the left. If I come up with a machine that requires more workers to work it, that's complementary with labor, so then my demand for labor would shift to the right. Okay, but the point is these are the things that affect the demand for labor. Okay? So, and by the way, what affects the marginal product of labor? Technology. Technology typically makes my workers more productive. So technology usually will shift the demand to the right. Sometimes technology can be considered another input, and then its effect on the demand for labor really depends on whether that technology is a substitute for labor or complementary with labor. If it's a substitute for labor, then the demand for labor would shift to the left. If it's complementary with labor, the demand for labor would shift to the right. Okay, so we have basically the demand for labor at the firm level for each firm. And we imagine that if you add up all the firms in the economy, you add up horizontally, so this is the demand for labor in this firm, this is the demand for labor in this firm. You add them up horizontally, and you end up with the market demand for labor, okay? Which is really the sum of the value of the marginal product of labor across all firms. That's the demand for labor. Okay. Now we're going to go to the supply of labor. Okay. So, or rather, let me go back to where we were. We said when we're hiring workers, we're comparing the marginal benefit with the marginal cost. And we said the marginal benefit is the value of marginal product of labor, which could be price times marginal product of labor, or marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. The marginal cost of labor, we're going to call that the marginal factor cost, right? Because it's the marginal cost of the factor of production, in this case labor, okay, which is abbreviated as MFC, marginal factor cost, okay? So the marginal factor cost depends on whether you're hiring workers from a perfectly competitive labor market or not, okay? So let's look at a situation where you're hiring workers from a perfectly competitive labor market. So this is the labor market, okay? Here's labor, here's the wage, okay? We have figured out that the demand for labor is the sum of the value of marginal product of labor across all firms. The supply of labor is an upward curve. In fact, we had a whole discussion when we spoke about income and substitution effects. So the income effect, okay, says that if I pay you a higher wage, you don't need to work as much, so then you would reduce your work effort. The substitution effect says if I pay you more, then not working becomes more expensive, so you end up working more. Okay? So typically we think that the substitution effect is stronger than the income effect, which means that if I pay you more, you work more. You work harder, because when I pay you more, the opportunity of your cost goes up, so not working becomes more expensive, and you always substitute away from the more expensive good. You substitute away from not working because it's too expensive, and you end up working more. Okay? All right, this was a whole discussion of how we got the supply curve to be upward sloping. I don't really want to focus that much on that. What I want to focus on is that in this labor market, we have a supply curve of labor, we have a demand curve of labor, and at the equilibrium, that's where the equilibrium wage is set. Okay? So if you are a firm hiring from a competitive labor market, the way to think about it is that a perfectly competitive labor market is a huge market where there's millions of workers and millions of firms hiring, okay? And so any particular firm comes to this market, they have no power to change the wage. They are a nobody. So similar to in perfect competition, when you had a perfectly competitive firm in the goods market, they took the price as given. Here also, any firm hiring from a perfectly competitive labor market takes the wage as given. Okay? And how do they decide how many workers to hire? So any particular firm, so this is the firm's decision, right? They put in the value of marginal product of labor, and that tells them how many workers they should hire. The last worker they hire, the value of that worker is just equal to the wage. Okay, so for the last worker, the marginal benefit, which is the value of marginal product of labor, is just equal to the marginal factor cost, which is the wage. So if you're hiring from a perfectly competitive labor market, okay, what is the additional cost of hiring one more worker? The marginal factor cost, it's the wage. Okay, and so whether I hire 10 workers or 1,000 workers or 1,000,000 workers, I am a nobody. I am taking the wage as given. I'm a price taker. I cannot affect the wage. So the marginal factor cost, the cost of hiring one more worker, is equal to the wage. This is analogous to, in perfect competition, that my marginal revenue was equal to the price. Here, my marginal factor cost is equal to the wage. Okay? And so if you're hiring from a perfectly competitive labor market, your condition for how many workers you should hire is where the value of marginal product of labor is equal to the wage. Okay, so if you're a perfectly competitive if you work in a perfectly competitive goods market, that's the same as saying price times marginal product of labor is equal to wage. If you're a monopolist in the goods market, it would be marginal revenue times marginal product of labor is equal to the wage. Okay, but the point is that the marginal factor cost is equal to the wage if you are hiring from a perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, so in such a situation, what happens if the government imposes a minimum wage? Okay, so that would be a case where, so this is a minimum wage, it's above the equilibrium wage for it to be binding. In that case, this would be the quantity of workers demanded. This would be the quantity of workers supplied. There would be an oversupply of workers, and therefore there would be unemployment. Fewer people would actually get hired compared to the equilibrium without the minimum wage. Okay? And this happens at the market level. It also happens at the firm level, because when the wage goes up, each firm similarly reduces how many workers they hire. Okay? This is the case if you're hiring from a perfectly competitive labor market. What if you're hiring from, you're not a perfectly competitive labor market? So what's the alternative? We know in the goods market, you could be a perfect competitor or a monopolist. A monopolist in the goods market meant you were the only seller. Okay? What does it mean to not hire from a perfectly competitive market? Well, in the labor market, if you have wage setting power, you are a monopsonist. So monopsony is one firm is hiring, and they're the only one hiring. Okay? So as opposed to with monopoly, you have one firm selling the good. Here, the monopsony is one firm hiring. So this would be a situation, for example, if a small town has only one hospital. So they're the only place where the surgeons and the nurses can work. So they have monopsony power. So they're no longer a price taker in the labor market. They don't take the wage as given. They set the wage. They have wage setting power. Okay, that's what a monopsonist is. Another example would be, let's say you're a mining town. The mining company is the only place you could work if you're a miner. The mining company is a monopsony. Okay, let's say you're a public school teacher. You can only work in the public schools. The public schools have monopsony power. They get to set the wage. Okay, how does that look like? So, if you're a monopsony, if you're the only firm hiring, so now we no longer have two graphs. Again, remember, in a perfectly competitive labor market, we had to draw the market, the labor demand. We took the wage from the labor demand and plugged it into our own, the firm's demand, okay? Here, the monopsonist, let's say the hospital, is the only one, okay? So what the monopsonist does is it looks at the supply of labor, okay? That's what it has to work with, okay? And with the monopsonist, let's say the hospital hiring workers, it recognizes that if it wants to hire one worker, it has to pay this wage, okay? If it wants to hire a second worker, it has to raise the wage to attract that second worker. If it wants to hire a third worker, it has to raise the wage to attract the third worker. Now realize that unless the firm is able to pay different wages to different workers, in other words, unless the firm is able to perfectly price discriminate to its workers, it has to pay the same wage to all its workers, which means that when I'm hiring the second worker, how much extra cost do I take on? Okay, so when I hire the second worker, okay, I have to now pay the wage 2, for the second worker, but I also have to pay the extra to my first worker. Okay, this was the price effect. Okay, but in order to hire the second worker, it wasn't enough. My marginal costs did not just go up by W2, they went up by W2 plus the increase in wage on the worker I was hiring before. This was the price effect. This is the quantity effect. So my marginal factor cost is greater than the wage because of the price effect. When I go from hiring 2 workers to 3 workers, okay, what's the additional cost of the third worker? Well, you had to pay the third worker W3, but then you had to pay W3 minus W2 to the previous 2 workers, okay? And as you hire more and more workers, the additional price effect is bigger and bigger because you're multiplying by a bigger and bigger number of workers you hired previously. And guess what? The marginal factor cost looks like this. This is a mirror image of when we had a monopolist in the goods market. Okay? The monopolist started off with the price, okay? Or rather, the monopolist started out with the demand curve, and the monopolist put down the marginal revenue associated with that demand curve, okay? Because in order to sell more goods, it had to lower the price for all the previous customers. Here, you're a monopsonist, you have pricing power, you get to set the wage. But because when you hire more and more workers, you have to raise the wage for all your previous workers, the marginal factor cost is actually higher than, steeper than the supply curve. Okay? Okay, so now how many workers do you hire? Well, this is the supply, this is the marginal factor cost, and we know your demand for labor is the value of marginal product of labor, okay? Which is either equal to price times marginal product of labor if you sell your goods in a perfectly competitive goods market, or it's equal to marginal revenue times marginal product of labor if you sell your goods in a monopolistic market. That's a different story, but this is your demand for workers, okay? So how many workers do you hire? You hire workers where the value of marginal product of labor, that's the benefit you get from each worker, is equal to the marginal factor cost. So the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost of the worker. That's how you decide the ideal number of workers you hire. And guess what? That's over here. In this case, you hire 2 workers. Okay? How much do you pay them? You pay them on the supply curve. The supply curve tells me the willingness of the workers, what wage they're willing to work at. Okay? Again, this is very analogous to what we did with monopoly in the goods market, where we said you choose how many goods to sell based on where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but then you charge a price on the demand curve. Here, you choose the number of workers to hire where the marginal factor cost is equal to the value of marginal product of labor, but you pay a wage on the supply curve. So the wage that you pay in the monopsony is less than the marginal factor cost. Okay? Okay, and so by the way, this is where, if you recall, when we spoke about why do people support minimum wage legislation, when it's clear that when you have a minimum wage, you end up, the demand for workers goes down, and it could cause unemployment. That is only true if you believe the labor market is competitive. If you believe the labor market is monopsonistic, then you think the workers are getting underpaid. And so by having minimum wage, you're forcing the firms to pay the workers more. You're giving some of the workers back some of the benefit that the monopsonists impose. Okay? So that's it. That's what I wanted to go over. And I wanted to make sure to cover it because it does show up increasingly on the AP exam, both in the long answer portion, it's coming up more and more, and it comes up quite a bit, and increasingly actually in the multiple choice section. I hope you found this review helpful.